3, 2, 1.
Hey class, this is Mr. Clark, and these are the video lecture notes for History 17B, Chapter 23, Americans and the Great War, 1914 to 1919. Next slide. Here's an overview of the chapter. First heading, American Isolationism and European Origins of the War. World War I began in 1914 after the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. However, this conflict had been building for decades. This was just the event that triggered it, and this is an artist's depiction of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Next slide. President Wilson had no desire to embroil the United States in the bloody and lengthy war that was devastating Europe. Next slide. His foreign policy through his first term and his campaign for re-election focused on keeping the United States out of the war. Next slide. Wilson only believed involving the country in international affairs if there was a moral imperative to do so. Next slide. After his 1916 re-election, however, the free trade associated with neutrality proved impossible to secure against the total war strategies of the belligerents, especially Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. Next slide. Ethnic ties to Europe meant that much of the general public was more than happy to remain neutral. There were a lot of German Americans, Irish Americans, English Americans, French Americans who had emotional ties to the conflict. Next slide. However, the German policy of unrestricted warfare and the publication of the Zimmermann telegram caused the United States to enter the war on the side of the Allies in April 1917. This cartoon shows these events. The Zimmermann telegram, by the way, was a German message to Mexico to get Mexico to declare war on the United States in return for land that Germany promised Mexico, including much of the southwest of the United States. Mexico did not accept this plan, but the publication of this message was the straw that broke the camel's back, I guess you can say, which got the United States into the war. Next slide. Wilson's reluctance to go to war was mirrored in Congress, where 56 congressmen voted against the war resolution. Next slide. The measure still passed, however, and the United States went to war against the wishes of many of its citizens. Next slide. The next heading is entitled, The United States Prepares for War. Wilson might have entered the war unwillingly, but once it became inevitable, he quickly moved to use federal legislation and government oversight to put into place the conditions for the nation's success. Next slide. First, he sought to ensure that all logistical needs, from fighting men to raw materials for wartime production, were in place and within government reach. Next slide. From legislating rail service to encouraging Americans to buy Liberty loans and, quote, bring the boys home sooner, end quote, the government worked to make sure that the conditions for success were in place. Next slide. Then came the more nuanced challenge of ensuring that a country of immigrants from both sides of the conflict fell into line as Americans first and foremost. Next slide. Aggressive propaganda campaigns combined with a series of restrictive laws to silence dissenters ensured that Americans would either support the war or at least stay silent. Next slide. While some conscientious objectors and others spoke out, the government efforts were largely successful in silencing those who had favored neutrality. Next slide. The next heading is entitled, A New Home Front. The First World War remade the world for all Americans, whether they served abroad or stayed home. Next slide. For some groups, such as women and blacks, the war provided opportunities for advancement. Next slide. In return for a no-strike pledge, workers gained the right to organize. Next slide. Many of these shifts were temporary, however, and the end of the war came with a cultural expectation that the old social order would be reinstated. Next slide. President Wilson's wartime agencies managed the wartime economy effectively, but closed immediately with the end of the war. One of those agencies was called the War Industries Board, which coordinated industrial production and the war effort. Next slide. While the patriotic fervor allowed progressives to pass prohibition, the strong demand for alcohol made the law unsustainable. Next slide. Women's suffrage, however, was a progressive movement that came to fruition in part because the circumstances of the war, unlike prohibition, it remained. Next slide. Next heading is entitled From War to Peace. American involvement in World War I came late in 1917. In fact, the United States was only in the war approximately 18 months. Next slide. Compared to the incredible carnage endured by Europe, the United States' battles were brief and successful. Next slide. Wilson had hoped that America's political influence would steer the world to a place of more open and tempered international negotiations. And Wilson's 14 points was his plan for the post-war world and peace. Next slide. His influence did lead to the creation of a League of Nations after the war, but concerns at home impeded the progress so completely that the United States never signed the treaty that Wilson had worked so hard to create. Next slide. The next heading is entitled Demobilization and its Difficult Aftermath. The end of a successful war did not bring the kind of celebration the country craved or anticipated. Next slide. The flu pandemic, economic troubles, and racial and ideological tensions combined to make the immediate post-war experience in the United States one of anxiety and discontent. This is a hospital showing or treatment of victims of the influenza epidemic of 1918-1919. Next slide. As the 1920 presidential election neared, Americans made it clear that they were seeking a break from the harsh realities the country had been forced to face through the previous years of progressive mandates and war. This is a Harding poster. Next slide. By voting in President Warren G. Harding in a landslide election, Americans indicated their desire for a government that would leave them alone, keep taxes low, and limit social progressivism and international intervention. And this map shows Harding's victory in 1920. Next slide. And that's it for chapter 23.